Yes, so this call today is about community monitoring and evidence gathering and how these tools can drive meaningful policy change. We'll be hearing stories from grassroots groups and communities who are using evidence in powerful ways as they respond to local challenges and build long-term strategies to influence laws, shift policies, and advance climate and environmental justice. So I'd like to start by introducing the Grassroots Justice Network. If you're new here, we are so glad you've joined us. We are a global community of more than 16,000 justice defenders across the world. We are activists, paralegals, organizers, educators, and public servants, all working to put the power of the law in the hands of the people. So what connects us is a shared approach called legal empowerment, which is helping communities um, know, use, and shape the law so that they can defend their rights and influence the decisions that affect their lives. Our members are on the front lines of struggles for justice, from fighting land grabs and gender-based violence to challenging statelessness and housing discrimination. So when we come together, we don't just share ideas, we build power and push for real change. If you're not yet part of the network, we'd love to have you with us. You can check us out and sign up using the link that has been shared in the chat. That's grassrootsjusticenetwork.org, and membership is free. So just to reiterate, like this, the network is a space for connecting, learning from each other, and supporting each other. So at this point, I'd like to invite Carlos from Namati to give us a brief introduction to community monitoring and evidence gathering. Carlos will take us through what we mean by evidence in the context of land and environmental justice advocacy. He'll also touch on different forms it can take, who produces it, and how it's used, and to whose benefit. So welcome, Carlos.
Thank you, Misioka. Good morning from Mexico to everyone. First, I want to thank the Grassroots Justice Network team, especially to you, Misioka, for putting all the effort and work to create this space so thoughtfully. I'm sure it's going to be a very enrichful conversation for all of us. Also want to thank the three panelists, Mohamedou, Mayerly, and James, for sharing your experience, and to all participants as well for making the time to be here. As Musioka was saying, I just want to give you a brief and general introduction to the conversation, trying to bring some elements that I think can be useful to frame what we understand as evidence when we add the component of community perspective. The ideas that I'm bringing here are part of a wider conversation that we had in May in Mexico with 50 environmental defenders from Latin America, where we try to answer four big questions. So what we understand as evidence, who produced the evidence, what shapes can it take, and also how it's being used. So this is not a closed definition or concept. This is just part of an ongoing conversation. In relation to the first question on what do we understand as evidence from a community perspective, we identified at least three basic elements. The first one is more like an epistemological debate. What is and what is not considered as validate evidence? And the conversation was that historically there is an exclusion of traditional and ancestral knowledge from what we consider as validate evidence. Only evidence produced through some rigorous and technical methodologies is what usually was considered as something that it was validate knowledge. And this is changing. Now, cultural practices, oral stories, collective memories from communities can also be considered as evidence. So it's not about underestimating technical and rigorous methodologies, but when we add the component of community perspective is that we understand that they can be more open and contextual. So evidence from community perspectives can be integrated as validate knowledge. The second one is evidence not only describe, it also seeks to transform. So when we talk about evidence from a community perspective, we are not only talking about a result from a technical process. We are also talking about a political and narrative tool. And it is political in the sense that it has an intention that goes beyond the validation of an environmental harm, for example. To produce evidence also looks to improve the life conditions of affected communities. And that is what it makes it political. And also it's a narrative tool because it shows that evidence is not produced in abstract condition, but it's a situated process in specific territories. The evidence in that sense is part of a collective story. So it's also a part of a narrative. And the third one is the recognition, and I think this is the central one, that the communities are the central political subject of these processes. The interests, the goals, the concerns, the living experience of these communities is what must shape the process of generating evidence. So at least those three components are the ones that, obviously there are more, but at least those three are the ones that define what we understand as evidence from a community perspective. Now, in relation to the second part on who produced the evidence, what shapes can it take, and how can we use, I'm just going to give you a brief general ideas on how we answer those questions. And I think we are in that one. Yes, thank you, Miseka. On who produces the evidence, I think that as any or most legal empowerment processes, the evidence gathering also involves different kind of factors. And the most typical one are three: communities, civil society organizations that work with these communities, and obviously technical expertise, such as researcher, academics, or different kind of expertise. The thing that I want to highlight is the position that each of these actors have in the process of generating evidence. And again, putting the community interested in the center. So the main idea on who produces the evidence is not only about the actors participating in the process, but how we balance the interest of each of them and how we decide what is the important thing or what do we want to prioritize. So sometimes this means that communities are the ones collecting the evidence, but sometimes it means that they are only pointing out where the evidence is. So this depends obviously on each context, but this is the main idea that I want to highlight, like how do we balance those interests and how do we put, again, communities in the center. The second one on relation to what shapes can it take? Well, it can go from technical aspects, even now more recently, such as satellite data, for example, to prove illegal lodging in some area. But it can also take forms of art, of culture, can also use cartographic maps, stories, and different other tools that can also take the shape of evidence. And the important issue that I want to raise is whatever shape the evidence can take, we should always consider how to bring it back to communities, the information that is being generated in this process. And the last one related on how we use it, we identified at least 4 spaces, 4 different kind of processes. Legal action, so we use evidence to sustain legal action, litigation, demands, for example. We also use evidence to participate in public participation process and decision making, to have more technical, strong arguments to present to authorities. We also use it to strengthen community organizing. So sometimes evidence does not necessarily have to go outside the communities, but it can help us to strengthen, to amplify the concerns of one group of a community. And the fourth one is as an advocacy effort. Especially we talk about communication campaigns, for example. And the reflection here, at least from my point of view, and the importance is that the same piece of information that we can generate, it can take different formats to have more impact in each of these spaces. So it's not the same way we present evidence that we generated in a process to a community than how we present it, for example, for a communication campaign or for a court. So that was a reflection on the challenge that we face to present evidence in different kind of forms. And to close up, because I think the most interesting thing of the conversation today are the panelists' experience. I also wanted to highlight 3 very concrete challenges that we also identify. The first one is there are no ideal circumstances to collect evidence, or usually there are not ideal circumstances. And many experience, at least from my point of view, evidence gathering processes are usually done under complex circumstances such as urgency, junctures of cases with deadlines, even security concerns for defenders or community leaders or even NGOs. This implies, from my point of view, that strategies and plans to collect evidence always must be built attending those circumstances and contemplated internal community dynamics. So we can learn to navigate the tension between the urgency of the moment, but also being able to integrate community concerns in the process. And also the importance to think about preventive strategies, ongoing monitoring to document, for example, environmental conditions beyond a specific moment. That's something that we are very interested to explore. The second one is that impact is not guaranteed. Like process can be very exhaustive for communities. Sometimes the evidence and the use of that evidence does not achieve the objectives or translate into specific improvements of life conditions. So also we need to learn how to manage expectations and put a lot of value on the process so capacities can be developed on that process. And the last one that I want to share is how we connect the local with the global spaces. Generally, the process of collecting or generating evidence by the nature respond to specific problematics, at least from the community perspective. And I think there is some very big opportunity for us to connect those findings and cases with more structural problematics. Climate change, I think, is the best example of this. Climate science has focused their efforts in generating information around sea levels, climate variation, amount of CO2 or methane emissions, but there's not that many data about how that information relates to the impacts that it has on specific territories and communities. So, for example, in climate change, there is a very big opportunity on how we can connect the data, the evidence that we are generating on our territories to influence those global spaces. So yeah, in very general sense of view, those were the ideas that I want to share. I think the three panelists that we are about to hear are an example on how some of these components can be understood in the light of specific experience. So again, thank you, and back to you, Musioka.
Thank you, Carlos, for that insightful overview. And at this point, it would be good to get a sense from everyone on what community monitoring means to you and your work. So we'll share a quick poll that will pop up on your screen. Maybe you could just have the poll pop up. Yep. You can see it. Like the first question is, what's your organization's current approach to gathering evidence? So if you have a regular system in place currently, do you only collect evidence in response to urgent issues? You do it occasionally or informally? Just starting to exploit, or if you currently are not also like collecting evidence at this point, that's also fine. So you could just click on the respond on the poll. Just give like 30 seconds for that. Yep. And also on the second question, poll question, which is what would be the most useful for you to learn about evidence gathering in this call? Would it be like the simple methods of gathering evidence? Is it building evidence into long-term strategy? Is it bridging local knowledge with legal policy systems? Or is it making sure evidence gathering is respectful and inclusive? And also all the above is also an acceptable answer. So I will just give it a couple more seconds for the poll before we end it. All right. Then 5 more seconds. Okay. Thank you all. and I will just share the results. Thank you all for your responses. It's clear that we're all coming to this work from different starting points, but many of us are thinking about how to do it more consistently, more strategically, and in ways that honor the knowledge within our communities. So now let's shift from poll to practice. We are excited to hear from our speakers today, each of whom brings grounded experience on how community monitoring and evidence gathering can drive change. So our first speaker from Senegal is Lamine, who is an environmental lawyer and program manager for rights affirmation at Natural Justice, with over 20 years of experience in NGOs and development projects. He specializes in environmental governance, legal empowerment, and participatory research. He holds degrees in law and environmental science and has led programs across West Africa on land, climate, and natural resources. Welcome, Lamine. Our second speaker from Colombia is Mayali, a human rights defender, environmental activist, a feminist, and lawyer specializing in public policy and gender justice. For the past 10 years, she has worked as a human rights researcher at the Latin American Institute for an Alternative Society and Law, advocating for justice and equality throughout the region. Welcome, Mayali. And our third speaker is from Liberia, James Otto. Is an activist with the Sustainable Development Institute. He's an advocate for human rights and sustainable development practices within his country, challenging the misperceptions of an anti-development and striving to engage effectively with international human rights mechanisms. So thank you all for joining this call. And as they share their experiences, we invite you to reflect on how these stories connect with your own context, what might be adaptable, and what sparks new ideas. And feel free to ask questions or clarifications or even your own experiences using the chat, and share and also can feel free to share any resources on community monitoring and evidence gathering in the chat that you would feel would be relevant for this discussion. So I'll start with our first speaker, James Otto. You've supported rural communities in using tools to collect evidence of harm. And as you take us through these tools and the impact that they've had, we'd like to also understand what keeps people continuing to gather this kind of information over time, even when there's no crisis.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity given us here at SDI to share what we are doing on monitoring, particularly how we use the tool, TIMBY, to document different violations across communities that are impacted by transnational corporations. So my name is James Otto, and I work here for the Sustainable Development Institute as one of its program leaders. So over the time we've been using a tool called TIMBY, and TIMBY is the acronym for This Is My Backyard. And the reason why we call it This Is My Backyard, because it is a tool that we use for communities to easily document different aspects of things happening around them. So just beyond your backyard, in your communities around you, what is impacting your life and how is that impacting the way your communities will respond to them. So that is TIMBY, and it's a tool that can be used on Android's phone, easily connected. You can document when you are in coverage, internet or other coverage and other internet areas. And once you're back in the internet, you can just download it to our dashboard. So it's a tool that we use to connect communities in the field to what happens at the national level. So like the previous speaker was talking about, how do we use the evidence to engage at national level? I will come to that. So over the past years, we've used that tool to kind of unearth violations on land, on the environment, and natural resource governance. So I will give a couple of examples. In 2011, we used TIMBY as the first tool. That was our first catch with TIMBY to expose huge violation within the forestry sector of Liberia, the private use permit. So the private use permit is in the Liberian National Forestry Reform Law, and that permit requires that communities' ownership of their forests and forest resources can get engaged into logging activities, so to speak, extraction activities, so to speak. but that needed to follow a vigorous steps, a couple of steps for it to be done. And so we realized that the government of Liberia was giving this permit us without any consultation with the communities themselves, without any consultation with civil society organization, without any consultation with the broader stakeholder in the country. So while leaving one of the community meetings in Lofa in 2011, we saw the truck. A truck was just going with logs on it and it's written PUP. And it was written PUP3. So we just took a picture of that and downloaded to our dashboard, our newly created dashboard. And then we started to investigate what does PUP means in Liberia? And has the government decided to go into PUP arrangements? So we wrote the Forestry Development Authority requesting information on whether or not they would engage in PUPs. So the government initially said, the Forestry Development Authority said, no, we're not into this. And then we wrote them back and said, yeah, it's a picture. Then they came back and said, oh, okay, we did a couple of PUPs, we got 3 PUPs. So we said, can we get the concession? Can we get the contract agreements? And then they said to us, oh, we don't have photocopier to print it. Can you come to photocopy it? So it was a revelation. When we went to kind of print it, we saw that the government has given more than 53 PUPs in the country. And so we used that as a first catch of Timmy to expose huge violation. There were 53 PUPs, some of them not properly legally documented, some of them giving us to even companies, concession companies, logging concession companies without any due diligence. So that was our first catch on Timby. Our second catch on Timby, using Timby, was on land grab. A company operating, an oil company operating in Liberia called EPO, Equatorial Palm Oil, decided to expand the land area without formally having any free, prior, and informed consent with the communities. They did not engage the communities. They just went to the government and few people in the government get an authority, so they started to declare the land. So we used Timmy to document. When the community started to raise concern and they started to call on SDI, we went there and used the app as a way of documenting the different steps that were taking place. And over a period of time, through a formal complaint to the RSPO, the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil, and the national government, we were able to push them for the company to start and agree not to further their expansion on the community land. Our third catch using Timby was was on what we call the Chevron Development Fund. The Chevron, Liberia was given its all blocks up to a range of different companies. So Chevron, as a mining company, decided to give 10.5 million to the Liberian people as a corporate responsibility, as a way of contributing towards Liberia's development. President Ellen Johnson then, through her son, who was head of NOCA, decided to kind of spread this money up. And so we decided to follow the money, because that's why we said we wanted to follow the money. And then they gave one communities in Lokentown like 700,000. 700,000 in a small place, they said they're given. The process did not follow the budget law of our country. It did not follow the financial management plans for our country. And so we documented and found that even the $700,000, the building we saw and the equipment could not even run up to 50,000. So those were our 3 cash using Timby. But I really want to talk about the main thing. What drives the communities to keep doing this? We think in our mind is a change they seek. They really want to see over a period of time. When we work with communities, one of our first strategies is to kind of let them know the laws that exist on the books, the processes that concessionaires and government authorities need to follow, and how they can participate. And so that change that they feel that they want to see happening in their country, in their communities, it is that is driving them towards and pushing forward towards ensuring that they document these different violations. So community monitors, few of them are at the county level, supported by us, but majority of them using their own phones, their own Android phones, are reporting to our dashboard on different violations. So that would be my first explanation. And if I'm given a second chance, I want to talk about what the communities, the evidence, what make it hard for them to use it. And I think that one example is the issue about weak enforcement systems. Once the evidence are brought to the national level or at the policy level decks, the government then should take appropriate actions. But what we're seeing over a period of time is the failure of the state to act. So I make reference to the PUP. When we took the PUP case, the government then decided to dismiss the authorities at the Forestry Development Authority. We saw that as a first good step. But going forward, the irregularities were not corrected. Today, in the forestry sector of Liberia, instead of PUPs, it's now called community forestry. And the same thing that I would saw in the PUPs, are happening in the community forestry. So we think weak enforcement sometimes is what kind of makes it difficult for people to push for real change. And I really wanted to stop there to see if I still have some more time to continue to give the lab when I really wanted to explain. Do I still have some time?
Yeah, you have like 2 minutes.
All right, so then lastly, I really want to paint a picture. How do we use the formal legal system with community knowledge? And the first part of our work as an institution is to mobilize and organize community in our project communities and identify key power actors. And this is very important because sometimes the information you need might not even be in the office of the district commissioner, might not be in the office of the town chief. Sometimes that information is held by a simple hunter who normally uses the forest for hunting. Maybe that information is held by local farmers, women who are doing collective farming at the waterside. So we kind of identify these different power brokers and learn from them how the decision making is taking place. So we'll document evidence, we'll take that information back to them so they are able to make their own decision, following their own channel. So if they have complaints at the community level, they want to seek the town chief, they want to go to the tribal chiefs, they want to go to the paramount chief, then before the commissioner. So we use these different channels as a way of seeking how traditionally indigenous knowledge can now influence the way they take action. So if they follow through these different channels and they get feedback that are now certified, they move to the next step. And in that way, we support them to come to the national level. And a key way to do that we've been able to do is to promote educational awareness using their own local languages. We produce the laws into local languages and share with them, and using the theater in the local vernaculars to teach them about the laws. Yeah, thank you very much, and I wanted to stop there and turn the floor over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you for the detailed explanation that you've given. And also thank you for highlighting the tool that you're using. That's the This Is My Backyard app. In terms of how you use it, in terms of exposing violations by companies, and also how you gone about filing using the data that you're collecting from the app in terms of filing formal complaints and actually seeing that having the government act on it and actually bringing remedial measures to it. And also thank you for bringing up the point on making the languages accessible to the local community. So that's actually very important as well. Thank you. And I'll also now head on to Lamine, the same question in terms of in Senegal, how you've been involved as natural justice in terms of community audits to document local environmental impacts. So I just want to also, if you could just also take us through the process on that and also how you've managed to build lasting systems of community monitoring using these systems. Thanks.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I think that we do have to consider several things. The work with communities is sometimes very hard because proofs are not easy to collect. That's the first point. Can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Lamine.
So, yes, working with communities is not always easy. It's not always easy to collect evidence and meaningful evidence and uncontested evidence. But we need to collect some evidences, and because they will help to defend our rights. So for the communities, we are doing some community audits that are tools used to reach some fundamental goals. The first one is to document things. Then community audits are not always used as a means of evidence as important as it should be. It's also a dialogue tool it's a kind of, we have to start thinking that the community need to dialogue with the authorities. And for that, they do need some tools. And there are also some extreme cases, and community audits can enrich the complaint files in some cases, and that's why they are important. It is important for the engagement of communities because they do give them the means to defend their rights, to fight for their rights. There are several things when we decide to collect some evidence, because there are several ways of collecting. Taking picture is one of the means, and we systematically try to take some pictures when collecting evidences. Even if there is no contentious, no litigation, we always find it useful to have some pictures taken from different moments. Before, for instance, in case of land grabbing, before the situation was this, and we have those pictures, then during, and then afterwards. And they will enrich the community audits. The members of the community, in many cases, when they do have some pictures, can just reinforce their files and defense. So the pictures will illustrate the evolution, the change of the situation, saying 10 years ago the situation was this, and today it is as it is, right? So it is a good way to make a comparison over time. So we are using pictures as a great evidence proof. Then we also use the smartphones and doing some videos, and community members are just taking their personal phones to make some videos as proof gathering means. And then there is another element that is very important, that are the stories and narratives from the communities and testimonies from people that are in the field, and they can tell us, well, things are as they are today. In the past, they were different, and it's kind of way of having a memory and an account of the evolution of the situation. So narratives are very important. And they are all documentation tools. Sometimes there is not enough publications on the situations. Nevertheless, in case of negative impacts, we do need to document things, have testimony, have memory of how things were, of the impacts that were produced. So these means of proof are very important. And very often, when we do collect evidence with a view to litigation, we do have to take some samples, and we try to work with the academy field, and they will ask us for some proofs. The universities can be a great help for us. So, for instance, in the Boro locality, it was a great help for us. We are using all those elements to really document very strongly the situations in the field of the community audits. So it's not only collecting information, it goes further. And when the community are collecting evidence on the field, they have the possibility to communicate, to transmit it. So we have collected information in the field, and we have a transmission to the authorities and the universities and so on and so forth. So what the communities can present as evidence are really a proof, very solid proofs of what is going on for them. But it is something that is done mainly by the communities and through the communities. And they are taking into consideration the situation of the communities and also the economic implications and things like that. Everything that can have an impact on the communities because it is coming from them. There is also the health impacts, and where the gathering of evidence is very important. Because it is something that is worrying that in the past didn't exist. For instance, we did some community audit in some places where there are, for instance, some plants, and we've been able to observe, thanks to the evidence collected, the health effect on the communities. For instance, I am thinking of a coal-fired plant. So we do need to use all the proceedings that we do have at hand. On the land aspect, we are using many testimonies for the communities, because sometimes the consequences are spreading over several kilometers. So it is a way of documenting things and see how the health of the community is impacted. In some areas, there are some extraction activities that are grabbing land and impacting negatively the land for agriculture. So we do need to have evidences of this. And in many cases, for the land grabbing or land impacts, it's not so difficult to prove what's going on. Each year, the extraction companies are deepening their activity, the impacts are higher for the communities, and so we are doing a systematical gathering of evidence because it is important, and we are doing a filing of those evidence. It is very important to keep trace of it, to have a proof of what's going on in the communities, in their lands, for the health, and so on. So that's for the community audits. Then we do analyze all the evidence that we are gathered. So that's how we are working, and I think I will stop for now, unless you have any more questions.
Thank you, Lamine, for that also great explanation as well. I think also thank you for bringing back the point of like gathering evidence is hard work, but it also gives communities a tool of fighting for their rights, and it also helps in terms of building the narratives in terms of if it's exposing any harms that they are facing, and that's very important. And also thank you for sharing that, like gathering the evidence systematically also over time helps in driving that narrative. So I'll move on to Mayali. So for Mali in Colombia, you worked with rural women to document environmental harms and also push for change. So I would just like to, if you could just walk us through like what's the process of been in terms of evidence collection, and also what impact has their knowledge had when it comes to influencing policies and laws in that region.
Hola, buen día.
Hi, good morning. Well, here in Colombia, in ILSA, which I form, the organization that I form part of, Latin American Institute for an Alternative Society, we try to think of the different scenarios and look at the different ways of gathering evidence. Like Lamin mentioned, what we do here is to look at a specific case. We try to find the way or the right tools needed to try to make progress and also try to train the communities and offer them some skills, maybe not just for the specific moment, but so that they could use these skills subsequently in other cases that we can offer them support with. It's also really important to start from certain specific axes. First, we have to look at the educational aspect. We have to look at the training. We have to look at common learning that will strengthen the community's participation so that they are present in the cases, that they have the arguments and so on. And this will also help with social mobilization in its different forms. Aside from that, we also have to think about the effect on public policies and regulations, and also the effects on environmental laws and any other projects that have an effect on the land and on their communities. And this is a bit like what Lamin mentioned earlier. We start our work based on the community knowledge, and what we do is to share based on popular advocacy. We use that knowledge and that popular knowledge to try to promote and strengthen the evidence, also using the same videos, photos, using other cases that can help with different cases. We also offer periodic reports, and a really important tool is that of social mapping. And this forms part of the popular and community tools that we apply. This is a way to provide a great panel to see what we have in the land, what the situation is, where people are, where the crops are, where we have rivers or any kind of water sources, what ecosystems we have there. We map all that out so that we can also compare if there are any damages, in our case, environmental damages or any other kinds of harms or changes that are unexpected, so that we can compare what we had then and what we have now. It's also been really important to interweave this, work with networks or allies, such as universities, who, their students can facilitate the work, or other people there could want to contribute to the cases, help us with our struggles. So that knowledge is also, that scientific or academic knowledge is also something that helps a great deal, precisely to strengthen that community knowledge. So it's also really important that based on that knowledge and based on these tools that we use to gather evidence, it's also really important to have another two that we have very much into account, and these are the scientific ones, which complement, as I mentioned just now. And then we also have the institutional knowledge that also exists formally in documents or on institutional or governmental websites. And so we try to do studies on that, or we try to find certain data there that could serve to strengthen what we're working on. All of this that is being done in terms of gathering evidence, this is something that we do precisely so that there is a more fair territorial development. It's really important to mention too, in this specific case, that we're working on with women who are in very vulnerable territories with huge inequalities, but they might also have given themselves the task of training themselves, strengthening themselves, defending their territories and the ecosystems they live in. And this has been a really interesting nexus, because with them we've been trying to look for evidence in different forms. On the one hand, environmental, but also on the other hand, looking at how this whole panorama of the system has demonstrated how women's body, just like the geographical land, are areas of a lack of control, how that affects women and also how that affects the whole community in their territory. So it's the importance of women being able to participate, of women being able to have that autonomy, that identity, and their own culture in each context, which is very much rooted in the communities. And it's really necessary to demonstrate that there are certain structural inequalities there, which mean that we need social justice there in a way that we can move towards environmental justice too. We need, both things go together. So I wanted to mention a specific case here which arose here in Colombia, which precisely has to do with the evidence. And it's the case of a young woman, a 27-year-old woman, and she was washing clothes in her house, and this has nothing to do with the use of illicit crops and the anti-drugs policies, specifically the US ones, got here very strongly because Colombia is one of the main countries that grows coca, and so there's a national policy and an international policy to get rid of these illicit crops. And this woman was washing her clothing. She's 27 years old, a young woman, a pregnant woman as well. And the planes flew past, dropping glyphosate, which is how they use these on the coca crops. And she didn't manage to run into the house to find shelter. So what happened was that she was completely soaked in glyphosate by this plane. So automatically, just a few hours later, she had a miscarriage. Her health started to deteriorate, and in the 6 months after that, she died. The family, what they decided to do was to report the Colombian state. They reported to them about this case, and they didn't pay attention to them. They said that as this was a US policy, then at that time, that claim was then passed on to the Inter-American Commission to evaluate this specific case. So we were able to see how in Colombia they are constantly bringing out policies about using glyphosate, not using it, they use it again. But this is fairly substantial evidence that we have, and that has now reached international courts, which demonstrates that glyphosate leads to environmental damage and also has a substantial impact on people as well. And this is a good way to try to defend what is happening here and in many other places, certainly too. What I wanted to say as well is that the women's struggle is one for humanity and for our lands, and it includes our land and our bodies and everything that lives in the land. So through evidence, we try to reclaim our rights. We include humans and non-humans in that, and precisely that's to achieve environmental justice. And just to conclude, I wanted to mention that it's also really important that when we're looking for evidence, which is what we've been doing here, that we decide who that's for, because sometimes we search for so much evidence, we end up giving that evidence to those who finally want to intervene and want to damage the territory in some way. So we have to be very careful with the evidence that we're gathering so that we're not giving all of the evidence, not handing all of it over, thinking about environmental licensing, for example, for a company that wants to extract some mineral or oil. If we are working in this struggle with companies, if we give them all of this evidence, then they're going to have all of the information to put that into their licensing process. But if we hold on to some very strategic information that we can use to defend ourselves, such as this social map that I mentioned earlier, then we can have tools for the future to continue to defend the lands. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mayali. Thank you. And also, I appreciate how you've brought in the fact that evidence, also like collaborating with institutions like students and universities to help in terms of gathering evidence, and also being strategic in terms of how we're using the evidence so that you can use it for long-term defense of territories and also against violations by companies. And also just to follow up on that, I see for you, Mayali, we often see like there's a disconnect between community gathered evidence for individual cases and using it to promote systemic change in national laws or public policies. Like, how have you addressed the gap between the evidence that is gathered and also how it's used to influence policies?
Bueno, entonces, como las políticas generalmente van enfocadas
Well, given that the policies are focused on strengthening everything to do with companies and corporations and their interests, we try to, within the impact we want to have on the policies, we try to position a political and social agenda that they have in the communities. And that's why it's important to organize ourselves as a collective to define what those policies are that are needed by the communities on a local or kind of departmental level or at a national level. Here in Colombia, we have different departments. So it would also be important that the communities are clear on the policies that are existing on an environmental level or those that might start to come up in such a way that they can participate and add to them the different aspects that they need so that they could put that feeling there of the community. And that's not going to happen if there's no participation. That's not going to happen if people don't have training, because it's really difficult because of the different isolated areas. And there are also different precarious areas, vulnerable areas where people are trying to survive. It's difficult for them to have this knowledge of the policies that are existing. So that's precisely our role and our task, which is to try to combine that knowledge that we've been acquired together with the knowledge that the communities have. And this really strengthens everything immensely. This has helped us to have this participation from the communities in different local and national policies that strengthen both the rights of women, rights of children, of young people, of more vulnerable people, but also not just thinking about humankind, thinking also about ecosystems. So here in Colombia, we have a public policy called the Public Policies on the Boundaries of Páramos, which is a very strategic ecosystem. There aren't many places in the world like that, but here we have in Colombia 50% of the Páramo regions of the whole world. So it's also important that the women, as well as everybody else participating, it's important that women participate because they can explain exactly why it's important that women participate, because there are very specific conditions where the life of women takes place in these ecosystems which are very high up in the mountain, these Paramo regions, where women have this intrinsic relation to do with the gathering of water, to do with the care of reproductive rights or menstrual rights, and also because they're such isolated areas, it's really important that within those public policies which seem merely environmental, it's important that the specificities of the different subjects in those areas are taken into account. These different individuals that live in these territories must be taken into account. So it's important not just to recognize that humankind has damaged the environment, but it's also important to recognize that there are humans who have done good, who have protected these territories and these ecosystems, and also looking at how they are doing that, and in such a way that they can show that these things are happening, but show that it is possible to live there in a way that cares for the environment. And so, there are different threads here that have to be taken into account and have to be strengthened the whole time, because, as I mentioned, the government doesn't manage to reach so many people. It doesn't manage to get to these faraway areas. So our task is to, gather that evidence, join up. In this case, we're looking at so many different regions. So we have to try to take that knowledge to the territories and talk to the communities about this information we've been gathering, and so that they can use this information as tools.
Thank you, Mayali. And also just as a reminder for everyone, you can just share your questions in the chat and we'll get to them in a minute. But also I'd like to ask the same question to Lamine in terms of addressing the gap between the community gathered evidence and also how and when it comes to influencing policies at the national level.
Thank you. I think that there's something very important from what Mayali said. Environmental policies are not only about ecosystems, they're about human beings. It's a human law issue. When communities are fighting for their territories, we have to understand too, it is a global issue about rights. And you've mentioned something specific to women, for land, for communities. In some areas, you have to think about it when you want to convey political change. This is important, I think. Now, the evidence that we collect through the use of community tools, I told you, this is evidence that we are already using for two things. First, to improve the dialogue between communities and companies, because most of the time companies are violating the rights of the communities, but the state to the government through the policies can also violate the community rights, because when they want to sign the contracts with the companies, if the government would have taken into account more of those needs, the problems would not arise. But whatever the situation is, even if after an action, if the communities address the companies or the government, whether it's a success or not, it always has an impact. For instance, we want that communities take an action, but if it fails, even if it's not a success, it can entail some reference, some change later. So I'm saying, we try that, yeah, whatever the outcome is, there's always an impact on policies. So what we try and do, we try and make the government that they take into account what they have to do it before, and the communities intervene when there hasn't been any steps taken beforehand. When there's a situation with negative impact, this is what we're telling the government. Maybe you didn't take us into account, so you forgot this. And what we don't develop community audits only for this. There is also incidents work beyond this with capacity building and training so that the communities know what are their rights regarding the environment. What is law? What is an environmental law? Based on this knowledge, the community can push this change, push for this change. So in Senegal, we started from a lawsuit from some communities. After community audits, the communities asked for the authorization to be withdrawn. So first, the government didn't recognize the rights of the communities to proceed to a lawsuit because they needed an agreement from the environment ministry. This is what the law says. For an association to open a lawsuit, the environment ministry has to agree on that. So we explain we're just an association, and we have an agreement from the Interior Affairs Minister. So we have this right, and this right is universal in our constitution. So the judge said, yeah, I can't give you, I can tell you yes, because the law is like this. So it's failed. But after this action, there has been a debate on a national level, and this position was changed. What is being changed? It is being reviewed right now within the law because the whole society has asked for that. So you've seen the action failed, but it inspired a change. Whatever the outcome, if it is a victory or not, these community tools are an inspiration. Maybe there are other cases, other examples that I could bring up. Community consultations. There's a recent law about biodiversity protection in Senegal. Before the law is voted, we're going to try and see what our community is thinking about it to avoid litigation. So, and we gathered communities, we discussed, and we explained this is what the government wants to do. And the communities were asking, are they going to add this? Are going to remove that? So we transmitted to the parliament, and they're reading right now, and they're probably are going to taking this into account, anticipating before gathering evidence. We integrate the concerns of the communities to avoid the negative steps. So this is a moment where we can have an impact, anticipating or either afterwards.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lamine. And now I think we can move on to some questions in the chat. I think the first question is to James in terms of the app, the This Is My Backyard app. So the question is if it's free to be used by anyone elsewhere, or is it limited to SDI and its partners? That's a question by Elias from the Indigenous community.
Yeah, so in Liberia, Timmy can be used by any community member who has interest in using the app. We can upload the app on your Android phone, and then we assign a number to you if you are interested in following and rights violations, documenting, and forest and environmental harms. We'd assign a number to you, and whenever you document a story, you send them to the dashboard. It comes into our office, and then there's a person assigned to the dashboard. She's responsible for documenting, colliding all the different information. So it's a usable tool. It's a very easy to use tool. And once you have an Android form, you can take it. You can use that. What is something important is that recently we have had other organizations in Liberia establishing TIMBI by using it, establishing their own dashboard, or using it for different accountability purposes. So, for example, Centaur, a financial accountability and transparency organization in Liberia, has been using TIMBI to document and tracking budget activities, how national budget is being managed, is being used. So they're using TIMBI for that, using TIMBI as so yeah, it can be used by citizens in country. If you have interest in using it across, we can connect it to the tech team. There's a US-based tech team that manage the whole TIMBI, the TIMBI tech team, and we can put you in contact with them, and you can begin to kind of work directly with them to establish your own dashboard. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, James. And in case if anyone else has would like to contribute or just have a question to ask the panelists, feel free to raise your hand, and you can we can sit and can unmute you so that you can raise the question. But in the meantime, there's a question here by that I'd want to share from the chat. This one goes to Mayali in terms of obtaining consent. So have you experienced any challenges in obtaining consent to use some pieces of evidence, maybe due to security concerns, and how do you manage or address that kind of a situation?
Bueno, sí, esto es muy importante más.
Well, yeah, that's really important because in Colombia, as you all know, there is still an armed conflict, but we're also the first country in the world, at least in 3 consecutive years, that has seen violence against defenders, environmental leaders, environmental defenders. So we've always tried, and also just to answer partly a comment that I saw in the chat about Venezuela, about how difficult it is to make a complaint and file a complaint in our countries. I think it's important to respond to the two together because we have to take into account we need to have different strategies and tools in place because these are processes that take a lot of time and that also involve taking care of ourselves because the context is too difficult and hostile and violent. So these ways of protecting us include creating networks so that we can offer support to one another, protect each other. It's also to do with strategies, and this is what is mentioned in the question, that this would involve how we can give consent and how we can make sure that it's always remembered who can or who cannot speak in public or file the complaint, make the complaint. It's also incredibly important to keep changing who talks before whom, how it's done as well, because if it's always me speaking, I'm exposing myself because they're going to see me as a possible leader, and this will then leave us exposed. I'm giving this example using myself, but we can also talk about the people who are leading the community-led processes. So it's also important at all times to make sure that the people who we are gathering evidence with or who we're writing reports with or the different ways that we're looking at gathering evidence, it's important that they know what that evidence is going to be used for. And we also have to think about who is filing that information It's important that we know if we're talking about an organization, specific people, etc., so that people can be aware and take on the risks or not that this may involve. So it's always really important to understand what the evidence is going to be used for, what the risks are behind submitting this evidence, or the processes that we're leading. And we also have to look at, even just with a single photo, if we're going to be doing an activity, if in that photo there's somebody who says, look, for security reasons, safety reasons, I can't appear in that photo, then we have to take that into account. I think it was more or less along those lines, the answer to that question. But generally, we try to act from a point of looking after ourselves, caring for ourselves, and looking at what is being consented in the communities. It's important because in the end, the organizations, those who form part of the organizations, these NGOs or civil society organizations can leave the land, but the people who live there are going to be there for a longer time. So we have to be very careful in precisely what we do with the information, how we use that information, and make sure that everybody who's forming part of these processes knows what we're doing and the risks involved and who we're also facing with these risks.
Thank you, Mayali. I think the other question is by Tim Dar. Tim, if you'd like to just unmute yourself and say the question and ask your question for more clarity.
Yes, I can. I'm here.
Yep.
Hi, everyone, and thanks again. This is really quite fascinating and great to hear, and thankful for the opportunity to listen in. I was interested just in, I know it's kind of been mentioned, I see in the chat a little bit of the instances where there isn't the political will or the capacity, or maybe even cases where the government is working with the companies to enable some of these violations on community territories, and I'm thinking more of the alternative pathways that maybe you've seen or have been explored by communities to use this data to go or to maybe work around the government where they're not being helpful or supportive, and maybe engaging progressive companies directly who may be able to or be maybe more willing to act and support in these instances. But more broadly, just interested in kind of what are some of the alternative solutions to seek dialogue and negotiations with relevant stakeholders when the government is particularly not supportive.
So as the speakers think about it, I think Lugendo, would you want to also ask your question? Okay, then Jim can go ahead and yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Tim, for that question. I think this is a very important question, so to speak. What we're seeing, particularly in the case of Liberia, is that once the evidence is documented and is concretized in terms of verify evidence to show that that evidence is authentic, it's real, it's something that has taken place, because that's one of the things we do. When our reporters take the evidence, whether it's a photo, whether it's a video or audio, and send it on the dashboard, we follow up with that information to verify the information. So to the point that most of the Android phones we use will put a GPS reference point. So when you're taking a photo, it has to have a GPS reference point that we can follow up the case. But one of the things we're seeing over a period of time is that when you bring these the kind of data to the government, sometimes the government they kind of dismiss it in the first instance. And in the case of Liberia, the government official or the government authorities will want to dismiss that evidence. And so what we do, we use that same evidence to go back to other alternative sources, other alternative forums. That is engage with that institution, whether it's a transnational corporation that is engaged. And I will give one example. When we did a report on GVL in 2018, it's called High Risk in the Rainforest, we identified through using TIMBE that more than 100 hectares, 1,000 hectares of team habitats were destroyed by the company. We wrote the company and the government highlighting that because the areas that were cleared were being determined by the Forestry Development Authority as team habitat in their own research done many years back, even before the company was allocated the land area. So the company and the government dismissed that. So we took that information to the high carbon stock approach and said, hang on, Golden Agro Resources, which is a parent body to Golden Viridian Liberia, is a member of the high carbon stock approach. And the high carbon stock approach requires that all companies should fall in line with spare high carbon value areas. So if GVL is part of your arrangement, could you go after this? So the high carbon stock approach then took GVL to tax. And then when the high carbon stock approach decided to investigate, then the company came back and said, yes, they acknowledge the fact that they cleared Tim's habitat. So I'm actually trying to respond to Tim's question here. You know, in some instances, you go to the government, and when the government dismisses, then you go to alternative. Like in the case of the Joban land with EPO, what did we do? We took a formal complaint to the RSPO, knowing that the company was a member of the RSPO. So we took a formal complaint to the RSPO and said, look, here are the facts. We have all the evidences. They are right here. Could you kind of find a way to ask the company to fall in line? So once the international bodies that the companies are attached to take steps, then the government is now allowed to drag itself in, even though they've said no at the beginning, but the international bodies are already involved. So in that way, we've been able to do that. The other tier to your question is issue about dialogue. And this is a very tricky point. And for us in SDI as an environmental rights-based organization, and dialogue we think is only intended, and like borrowing the words of other environmentalists, to greenwash sometimes the situation. It doesn't really address the core issues. So what we decided to do now is to move towards litigation, testing our court systems, using the laws that exist on the book. The laws are the guiding principle that we use to take legal action. So in instances where we took a complaint of a company to the government, and not just the government in its entirety, but the agencies and ministry of the government responsible, and there's no action, then we'll move towards the policy actors, and if there's no action, then we'll go after the international bodies that are connected to the companies. And where we don't find any redress, of course, we go to litigation. And some of these have been able to produce some results, and some of them have not been able to produce. Like, for example, even though the RSPO made a decision on GVL when we took a complaint, that the company must address the different violations that the investigator and found the company culpable of, it took the company a long time, and in some of them, they haven't even addressed them. And so in those instances, they will move towards a higher level to go to court. So I just wanted to paint a little picture of your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. And also just on to Lugendo's question, which touches on community auditing. He asks, how do you behave during a community audit of mining sites illegally secured by the military when we want to preserve evidence in the face of the statute of limitations on legal defense actions? I think Lamin, you would be best to answer that question. Yep. Let's go ahead, Lamin.
Oui, merci Lugendo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lugendo. I was very interested in what Tim just mentioned also, and it reminds me the coal-fired plant unit, because there was a complaint filed before the judge, and also the African Bank of Development that was involved. And the bank had organized a meeting with the representatives of the plant and the communities, and there were no agreement found. So one of the partners of the bank, which is a Dutch bank, that is working with communities was involved. And so what the community had collected as evidence, and the Dutch bank withdrew from the donors group because it wanted to be protected, because there was a complaint that was being filed. So that's another example, because the other donors just gathered to replace the Dutch bank that just withdraws. So the aspect of the involvement in negotiation processes is very important, and I wanted to stress upon this. And sometimes it is hard to understand what we can do from the legal point of view, what kind of actions we do have, and it is very hard to understand well what we do have and how we can influence. Now, as for the RDC, it is a different context, because it's a country that is very different. We do not have this military situation here, and we have different constraints. So the community audits will be done differently. Okay, so evidences will be gathered in a different way. And as I was mentioning before, the context always has to be taken into account. So that would be hard to give a definitive answer to Lugendo.
Okay. Thank you, Lamin. And also thank you all the speakers and also every the participants for your questions at this point. I think we do not have any other question at this time. And we've really I'd like thank the speakers in terms of sharing the experiences, and also the when it comes to community monitoring in their countries, and just sharing how they're actually doing it in their countries, and what kind of progress it's bringing when it comes to influencing policies for their communities. I think at this point, with that, thanks, I'd like to proceed to the next phase of the call, so that we can just conclude, which is just a number of announcements in terms of engaging with the network. As you can see on your screen right now, you can join the network. If you're not already a member, where we also have working groups, and we have members joining, connecting monthly. There's the climate finance working group, there's a community engagement working group, and also there's the gender working group, which meets quarterly. And members get to share, connect, and share ideas when it comes to the work that they're doing in the different contexts, in their different countries, but with a similar goals. The next thing is in terms of connecting with us, you can connect with us by signing up to our monthly newsletter. That is also, the link will also been shared in the chat below. And there on the monthly newsletter, we share updates in terms of opportunities and network member stories, and also just everything that is on the land and environmental justice sector. The next announcement that I'd like to make today is the GJNA, that's the Grassroots Justice Network Academy, that is coming up in 2026. The Academy, just to give you a brief background, is that it builds on more than 10 years of work we've done together with network members. It will offer practical tools, shared experiences, and space for deeper learning, collaboration, and care. And we will share more details on this soon. But that said, you don't have to wait until next year to get started. This August, we are launching the Carbon Justice 101 course, which is a self-paced online course created by and for network members. It's made for community advocates who want to better understand nature-based carbon projects and how they affect land rights and justice at all levels. So to take the course, you need to be registered to be a member of the network, basically. And if you want to get an alert when the course is ready, please fill the form shared in the chat. And with those announcements, I think all this information and the recording for this call will be shared in a follow-up email. So I'd just like to once again thank everybody. Thank you to our speakers today. Thank you, Carlos, and also thank you everyone for joining us and engaging and also asking questions. We hope to connect more in this space within the network. And also, I'd like to thank our interpreters for their support, and also just thank you all. Thanks all to all the participants for being part of this important discussion. So thank you, and have a lovely rest of your day. So thank you, and goodbye. All right.